Hello, guys, and welcome back to the C Team Pod. I'm your host, Emmitt Sevores, and alongside me, I have Steezy Smith filling in for Dallas Wicklander. How are you doing, Steezy?
Man, I'm feeling great, bro. Feeling good. Excited to do this, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. I think this is probably your third or fourth time back on. I always love having you on. Can't wait to get into this discussion about the Carolina Panthers. Again, it's like we've had you on for the two NFC South teams so far. Hope we'll see if the trend winds up continuing. But yeah, I have them ranked 26th on our NFL Power Rankings, which is actually high for what a lot. I've seen a lot of ones where they had they're ranked at anywhere in the 30s. I've definitely seen them ranked dead last, especially because of their quarterback situation, which we'll get into a little bit later. But Steezy, let's start it off. What do you think went wrong for the Panthers last year?
A lot. I think a lot of it has to do with Christian McCaffrey only playing in 7 games. But that's kind of been the problem, right? For the last couple of years, he's been unable to stay healthy. But they won 5 games last year with him in the lineup. They were 4-3. Now without him, 1-9. And so obviously he's the engine, not just what they do offensively, but he's the heart and soul of their entire team. And so I think a big part of what went wrong last year was him not being available, but also defensively, while the numbers might show that they were solid in the red zone, they struggled immensely. I think if I'm looking at the stats right, opponents scored touchdowns on 67.3% of their chances in the red zone, which ranked 29th in the NFL. This is the only team to finish in the NFL with the top 3 defense, total defense, as far as I think total yards allowed, and then a bottom 3 offense. And so on top of that, I mean, just not having a quarterback. Offensive line was relative to others pretty bad. Gave up 52 sacks. And you're just not going to be winning games with Sam Darnold as your starting quarterback. He's going to need a lot of support, and they didn't really have that last year. Obviously, outside of a Christian McCaffrey. I mean, this team started off hot. Remember, once upon a time, this team was 3-0 after the first 3 weeks of the season. After 10 games, they were 5-5, and then they closed out the season on a 7-game losing streak. And so they went from 5-5 to 5-12, dead last in the NFC South. But I just remember a lot of people were pegging this team as playoff contenders, in the beginning of the year. And maybe they will be, with the Baker Mayfield, which we might touch on, with the healthy Christian McCaffrey, which we're going to, continue to touch on as well. So it was a plethora of things, but mainly Christian McCaffrey's injury issues and just the lack of a reliable quarterback, lack of an offensive line, and a defense that struggled in the red zone.
Well, I think if you look at the first 3 weeks of their season, as you touched on, they started off 3-0, but the defense was playing extremely well, but they weren't playing against a whole lot of anyone. They played against Houston. They played against the Jets, two teams that had top 4 picks in the draft. They played against the Saints, and this is the Saints that, again, I think they were starting, Jameis Winston, but they were just coming off of, an irrepeatable week 1 against the Packers when you look at the Saints. So I think, you look at that and how well the defense was playing. And then if you look at week 4, I remember watching this game. They were playing against the Dallas Cowboys. They were at Dallas, and Sam Darnold looked horrible. It was honestly like the Trayvon Diggs breakout game, if you really remember that. He had 2 picks off Sam Darnold, I think pushed his total to 4 for the year through the first 3 weeks of the season. But it was just, it felt very fluky to me. Like, I think everyone watching kind of felt that there was a little bit of fluke to it. And then, after that game, it was just like, okay, maybe Sam Darnold hasn't changed. Because if you look and like post that game, Sam Darnold didn't get to over 300 passing yards for the rest of the season in terms of their games. And honestly, they didn't have a single, high, like their highest passer didn't get above 300 yards for the rest of the season. They only got above 200 yards twice. That's Sam Darnold in a loss to Minnesota, and Sam Darnold in the very last game of the season. Their quarterback room for that, for the rest of that year, it was pretty brutal. And honestly, it's not looking too hot right now either. But you look at the team, and one of the big focus points has been Matt Rule. He's kind of Shannon Sharp had a very good quote yesterday. I don't know if you were watching that, but they were talking about Baker Mayfield potentially going to the Panthers, and he was saying, how is Baker Mayfield going to save Matt Rule's job if he couldn't save his own? Matt Rule's job is for sure. It's up in the air. It's not solid right now. I definitely think that there's potential that if this season doesn't go well, he could be he could be getting fired obviously before the end of the season. But I think there's a very real chance that if they're picking in that top 5, top 10, that he's not going to be the head coach there next year.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's also a great point that you said Shannon Sharp brought it up on Undisputed.
Yep.
That's a great point, but I don't think making the playoffs should be the expectation for this team. I understand they've disappointed under a Matt Rule. What is it, 10-23 the last 2 years? There was a lot of hype around him coming out of Baylor. And I'm not trying to attribute this to injuries because at the end of the day, results, you do still have to, whether it's fair or not, you got to put results forward. And so we haven't been seeing that. But I think the bar to clear should at least just be above 5 because they've had 5 wins the last couple of years, and that's been with the roster that hasn't been able to stay healthy. And so I don't think they should be judged, based off of that. I think by bringing in a Baker Mayfield, I know we'll touch on this later, but I think it actually could potentially save his job. I'm not saying they're going to make the playoffs with the Baker Mayfield, but I could see them winning 6 games, 7 games. And as long as we're seeing improvement, then I think Matt Rule's job could be safe, but I think it also is safe to say that he is on a hot seat. Hence the pressure to go after a Baker Mayfield. I've been advocating for them to trade for a Baker Mayfield for the last couple of months now because Matt Rule is on a hot seat. He needs to start winning games now, and he has a better chance of doing that with the Baker Mayfield, not Matt Corral, not Sam Darnold.
Yeah, and I think especially with you look at how aggressive they've been under, this new ownership group and new GM and new head coach of Matt Rule. Again, last year they traded for Stephon Gilmore. No one thought that they were going to be able to add Stephon Gilmore. I guess no one had them, pegged as a team who was going to go out and get Gilmore. Then obviously last year they also traded for Sam Darnold before the season. So they've been quite aggressive in that sort of market. So it wouldn't shock me, if they do wind up going after a Baker Mayfield. But moving past Matt Rule, they didn't do too much in free agency. I think honestly their biggest moves were letting people go. Obviously, they let Stephon Gilmore go to Indianapolis, and then they let Hassan Reddick go. Reddick was one of the big signings for the Philadelphia Eagles this year, and that's why I had the Eagle. That signing along with some of their other ones is why I put the Eagles up in the free agency winners category. But what did you think, as a whole for the Carolina Panthers free agency? Because they did still add some guys like, Xavier Woods. They added Johnny Hecker, the longtime punter for the Rams. Obviously, that's not super huge, but it is something because I do think this team there's definitely potential that they're going to be punting a lot.
Hey, I agree. I agree with you, Emmitt. But honestly, I think when you have a punter, no matter how good he is, when he's headlining your free agency class, I don't think he did a very solid job. Now, that's not to say that they signed a bunch of scrubs because I feel like they filled out a bunch of the margins. They filled out a whole bunch of depth. They brought on a whole bunch of depth guys. I mean, they needed help on the offensive line. They brought in Austin Corbett. They brought in Bradley Bozeman, Deontay Foreman, who filled in, I think, admirably for Derrick Henry last year to kind of, use as insurance for Christian McCaffrey. But again, I mean, Johnny Hecker it looks like he's one of the crown jewels of this free agency class, if you want to call it that. And so I guess it was, to say the least, underwhelming, I mean to say. And so if I had to put a grade on it, I'd say just a C, honestly. I mean, nothing splashy, but at the same time, they didn't sign a bunch of scrubs. They just kind of, filled out stuff on the margin. So I'd say
yeah. And what do you think about, that, the thought behind letting some of those guys go? Because again, you pointed out that they weren't the best in the red zone. But I think overall they were still a pretty solid defense. Obviously, they added J.C. Horn last year. I think it was the pick right before Pat Surtain. I think they got him 8th overall. So I mean, they did have good defensive pieces. So what do you think of just the whole them letting those two Stephon Gilmore and Hassan Reddick? What do you think of them letting those two defensive pieces go?
So with Stephon Gilmore, I think it was more of him wanting to go, not opting to re-sign with this young rebuilding team. He's getting a little older. What is he, 32, 33? And I think it's evident by the fact that he decided to sign with the Indianapolis Colts. That team is ready to win now. And I think that team is a dark horse contender in the AFC. And so I'm not going to fault the Carolina Panthers because if the guy just doesn't want to come back, he doesn't want to come back. They're not going to sign a contract with you. I mean, like you alluded to, bro, they traded for Stephon Gilmore. He didn't choose, to come there out of his own free will. And so him leaving, I'm not at all surprised. I'm not going to hold the Panthers, I'm not going to hold that against them. But I think with the Hassan Reddick, that was disappointing. I'm surprised Carolina let him go. Well, he had a career year last year, if I'm not mistaken. I probably should have done, my research on here, but I think he had double-digit sacks. Because I remember it was the second consecutive one-year deal that he signed, and he was able to parlay that into a 3-year, $45 million deal with the Philadelphia Eagles. And so He's still young. I definitely feel like he could fit the timeline of this rebuilding Panthers football team. And, he was one of the reasons why that Panthers defense was so effective last year. They're able to get after the quarterback, Brian Burns. He's had a couple of nice years with 9 sacks, both last year and the year prior. And so that was disappointing, to say the least. But I think, with Stephon Gilmore, he just didn't want to come back. And the Hassan Reddick, that was definitely very puzzling.
Yeah, and especially, as you pointed out, Hassan Reddick last year, he had 11 sacks. And especially looking at it, right now, the Carolina Panthers are second in salary cap space. They don't have a whole lot. They got $25 million in cap space, but they certainly had the money to pay Hassan Reddick if they wanted to. Especially with what we've seen with teams like the Rams just playing absolutely salary cap gymnastics. Like it does, they could have kept him if they absolutely wanted to. But I do think that they do have some young studs on defense. Obviously, they still got J.C. Horn. They got Brian Burns, as you pointed out. What about the draft? Obviously, I think I was quite shocked that at 6 that they took Ikem Ekwonu. Maybe that was their guy the entire time. We were obviously in the Bolt mock draft that we did, and every mock draft I did, I had him going Malik Willis at 6. But obviously, I think the entire NFL seemed to be kind of, I guess, out on Malik Willis as he fell all the way to the 3rd round. So, what did you think of the Panthers draft as a whole, and especially what do you think about what they did with their top pick?
I thought Ike Ekwonu, that was a home run of a pick. I mean, in the eyes of many, he was the best, offensive tackle prospect. He was better than an Evan Neal. He was better than a Charles Cross. I mean, the Jets were talking about taking him at number 4 overall. And so I'm not going to fault them. I'm not going to knock them for taking an Ike. I thought that was a steal. I didn't think they were going to go quarterback, whether that was going to be Malik Willis, Kenny Pickett, just because the gap from their 6th overall pick to the next pick was gargantuan. I mean, they didn't have a pick until the 4th round. And so if you take a quarterback, a raw quarterback, a quarterback that still has or needs a lot more polish, and you don't even know if he's going to start year 1, and then you're not picking again until the 4th round, I don't think you're really setting them up for success. And so I thought the Panthers did the right thing by taking the best player available, by taking arguably the best offensive lineman available, because like I talked about last year, but they gave up 52 sacks. Like, you can't do that. And so even when Sam Darnold was looking good his first 3 weeks in the season, he was taking sacks still. And so, I know Ike Ekwonu is not the most refined pass protecting, offensive tackle, but I believe he'll get there. You know what I mean? And I think the foundation, the traits, the tools, everything is there, the want to. And so I thought that was a great pick. To land a Matt Corral, what was it, the bottom of the 3rd round? That was an absolute steal. I mean, a lot of people had this guy going bottom of the 1st round, early 2nd round. And for him to slide all the way there, I think he's one of the reasons why Carolina has yet to trade for a Baker Mayfield. I still believe they had to trade for a Baker Mayfield, but to be able to get him in the 3rd round, on top of that, they didn't have too many draft picks. I think, what was it, a total of 5 or 6 draft picks, 6 picks that they made. And so obviously they didn't have a whole bunch to work with, but with what they did have, I want to give them a B-. You know what I mean? They got a quarterback prospect, whether or not he's a quarterback of the future. They needed to add to that quarterback room. They added who I feel like was arguably the best offensive tackle prospect in the draft. And then they were able to, add to the linebacking core. They added to other areas of need. And so I think overall, given the 6 selections, I'd give them a B-.
Yeah, and you talked about adding to that quarterback room, because that's what we're going to talk about next. That Carolina Panthers quarterback room, which I don't. It's going to be an absolute free for all until we get any sort of news about a Baker Mayfield trade. Because obviously, if Baker Mayfield gets traded there, he's going to be the starter, or that's at least the thought. Starting with that guy that you were talking about in Matt Corral, do you think that Matt Corral has the opportunity, or has the ability to win the starting job for the Panthers out of camp?
I definitely think he's capable. You know what I mean? Especially when you have a healthy Christian McCaffrey on the field. Christian McCaffrey is going to make everyone else around him look better. And the offensive line should be better. DJ Moore, the receivers, Terrace Marshall should take a step forward. And so he has pieces to work with. You know what I mean? Obviously, like we talked about earlier, that defense is more than competent. That defense can definitely hold their own. That defense definitely had more than a couple highlights last year. And so I think they're definitely building something defensively. However, I'm not going to say that he is going to. I'm just saying that he's capable, and I think that he, has or is in position to succeed. I just wouldn't bet on it. And we'll touch on this later, but it's because I have them landing another quarterback.
Yeah. And before we get to that other quarterback, what do you think about Do you think, as of right now, do you think Sam Darnold's the favorite to start to that team, or do you think that they've kind of run their 1 year course on Sam Darnold?
Well, I guess according to the reports, and we'd have to take it at its face value, but Matt Rule was talking about how the season started today. Sam Darnold would be the starter, and obviously that's not saying much because we all know the season doesn't start today. I mean, we're barely even in mandatory mini camps yet, if even that. And so I feel like he still has a chance to compete. I mean, again, and we keep talking about this, a whole bunch of injuries last year. And so who knows? I talked about Matt Corral looking better, with a healthier team around him, with a better team around him. I think it's safe to say that Sam Darnold could also look better with the healthier team around him. And so obviously, yeah, we want to give him a shot, or the Panthers want to give him a shot. They want to see what he can do with the healthy roster in front of him. I wouldn't say he's out of it yet, but I think the only reason why he does have that edge, quote unquote, edge over the rest of the guys is because he spent more time in the system than in Matt Corral, and he's been there for a couple years now. And so I think, that firsthand knowledge of the playbook, it's kind of reminiscent of that situation in Seattle. Pete Carroll's talking about how Geno Smith has the edge, quote unquote, over Drew Lock in the quarterback competition. But, the offseason really hasn't heated up yet. And so he really only has that edge because of prior experience in the system. I wouldn't say it's purely because of sheer talent. That's not why he has the edge. It's just because he has that experience. And so, but to answer the question though, no, eventually I don't think he will be the starter.
Yeah, and I think again that there's definitely potential, and we've heard all of the smoke about the Panthers potentially trading for Baker Mayfield, and so I got two questions here for you. We'll go with the first one because I think I know your answer, but I want to hear your explanation on it. So, should the Panthers trade for Baker Mayfield?
1,000%. 1,000%. I think if the Panthers are unable to eclipse at least and at the very least 5 wins, Matt Rule's out of here. And he does not want to be out of there. I can guarantee you. I mean, he left college for a reason. Not to say that was a bad job over at Baylor, but he's in the NFL for a reason. And so I'd like to think that he wants to keep his job safe in the Carolina. If he's going to do that, like we talked about, fair or not, the NFL needs results. And through 2 years, he has not been able to put up results. I think with the Baker Mayfield, who's significantly better than a Sam Darnold, who's further along in the process of being an NFL quarterback than a Matt Corral, that's going to give him, Baker Mayfield's going to give him a significant shot to eclipse 5 wins, 6 wins, 7 wins, potentially even compete for a wild card spot in the NFC, just because the NFC is so top heavy. There's a whole bunch of teams competing at the bottom, and I think the Panthers could potentially come out of it if they land a Baker Mayfield, and he is the best quarterback that's currently available. He's better than all their options on the depth chart. So yes, 1,000%, the Panthers should most definitely trade for a Baker Mayfield.
And here's the tricky part of this next question, because obviously we're not in those front office discussions. But will the Panthers trade for Baker Mayfield? I'm going to say that they're not going to. I'm going to take that side of the fence, and for a couple reasons. One, I think we've seen Robbie Anderson kind of voiced his displeasure, and I know he's kind of walked back his comments a little bit with saying he was just sticking up for, like, no disrespect to Baker, but he was just standing up for his guy and Sam Darnold, who he's obviously been with since New York. But I do think that is, you see a lot of the people in the league feel kind of out on Baker Mayfield. And you're seeing, especially because one of the arguments that I've seen, for the most time is it's like, oh, well, like there seems to be a lot of interest with Baker Mayfield, like as long as, he's a free agent, or they're not taking on that money. But if he's that guy that people really, believe he is, and he's a franchise quarterback in this league, you should be willing to eat, whatever it's going to be, you should be willing to eat $9 million if you really believe that they're going to be your franchise quarterback. And another part of one of the reasons that I don't think that they're going to wind up trading for Baker Mayfield, I think that they should, because I think you might as well kick the tires on everything, because we know for a fact Sam Darnold's not that guy. I think we know that Sam Darnold, we've seen his ceilings and we've seen his floors for a lot more of his career than we've seen his ceiling. But if this front office and this coaching staff misses on another quarterback, that's a lot of people's jobs. Obviously, if they hit on a quarterback, then that's a lot. Then their jobs are going to be safe. But I think if they miss on another one, their general manager is probably going to be being on the outside looking in. He's going to be looking for another job in another state for another team, because I think, especially if you look at, if they don't perform well this year, they're going to be right. And this is what part of why I think that Ikem Ekwonu pick was the right pick for them. Because if they, obviously last year wasn't a great quarterback draft. this next year seems to be at least at the top a good quarterback draft, right? Obviously, we have Bryce Young from Alabama, CJ Stroud from Ohio State. I know a lot of people don't like to really touch those, those big name school quarterbacks, but I think that obviously those are probably going to be the first two quarterbacks taken off the board. Maybe there's going to be, a third, a surprise like a Joe Burrow, where we going into it, where, we're thinking they could potentially be like a fourth or a fifth round pick, and all of a sudden they're in the first round. But I think that, them picking Ikem Ekwonu allows them to even, if they suck this year and they stick with what they've got in a Sam Darnold and a Matt Corral, it allows them to have that flexibility to take a quarterback this year. And so that's why I don't think that they're going to let this front office take another shot on a quarterback in the draft. So I think that they may play it a little bit safer than they have in years past in terms of going out and trying to acquire a quarterback.
No, and that makes all the sense in the world. I'm not trying to discredit that in any way, shape, or form. I just think that with Carolina, I mean, you just can't afford to be patient anymore. And Matt Rule, I mean, I think he's definitely feeling the heat. He's definitely feeling the pressure. And I think if Carolina and Cleveland has been this close, if the only real conversation, or if the only real thing that's holding them back is how much, Baker's going to get from the Panthers as opposed to the Browns, and I think we're pretty close to a deal. And I think the fact that it's even happening, especially around this time with mini camps approaching, I think that's a good sign, because it's like, oh, the Carolina Panthers, not only is there a sense of urgency to get this guy into the building, but we want to be able to integrate him into the offense, begin to establish chemistry with the rest of these guys. And yeah, I just don't think Matt Corral's ready yet, even though I know he's capable. I just don't think he's ready at the end of the day. And I mean, he's not going to want to go through another 5-win, 4-win, 3-win season. And especially with the NFC being wide open towards the bottom, I think Matt Rule should capitalize on this opportunity and go for a Baker Mayfield. So to answer the question, I mean, like you said, we're not in the front office, so we can't say, with any sort of assertiveness, we can't be definitive, in our answers, but I truly believe that they will.
Yeah, and I think that this could go either way. I really do. I think that, again, it just depends on how they feel about Baker Mayfield and how stubborn the Browns really are on how much of the contract they're going to eat up. Because I think that there's definitely potential. I think, as we've talked about before, that if Baker Mayfield, I don't think he's going to get flat out released. But if he does get released, I think you're going to see a lot of teams at least line up to, have him in the building. Like Seattle could potentially be one of those teams, because I know that Squabo, for example, is not sold on Drew Lock. I think you're a little bit more sold on Drew Lock, but I don't think you're not all the way in on Drew Lock. So I think, would you prefer a Baker Mayfield to a Drew Lock in that situation? Like, how many suitors do you think he would have if he was flat out released?
That's a great question. I think he'd definitely have 3 to 4. I think Seattle would definitely be in the running. Carolina could potentially be in the running. I know they drafted Kenny Pickett 20th overall, but I think Pittsburgh could potentially still be in the running and have that be a 3-man competition with Mitch, Kenny, Baker. And who knows, maybe Baker just balls out because he's able to stick it to the Browns, twice a year, with the Steelers. And so there's definitely going to be suitors. You know what I mean? I don't think he's a franchise quarterback in the NFL, but I think he's a starting quarterback in the NFL. And I think there's a difference between those two things. And there's still a few teams out there that could use an upgrade or that need a reliable starting quarterback. And we saw in Cleveland, we've talked about this before, bro, but when Baker Mayfield has pieces around him to work with, he can look competent. He can't look above average. And I think Carolina definitely has a lot to work with. And so I think him and Carolina, I think that's the perfect fit. But yeah, just to answer your question, there'd be a lot of suitors. And I think for Seattle, I'm definitely in favor of that. Not trading for him, but definitely signing him outright if he was to be released.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying about Baker Mayfield being able to work with pieces around him, you see what the Panthers have, and if everyone's able to stay healthy, I think obviously, again, we talked about that offensive line that they need to get a little bit better, but offensively they have pieces around them, right? I believe they have Curtis Samuel on offense. Obviously, they still have DJ Moore, and then obviously, again, as I said, Robbie Anderson, and then we always talk about Christian McCaffrey around this time, and even Chuba Hubbard was very good last year. He was very good filling in for Christian McCaffrey. So I think that there is definitely, potential that if he goes there, it could wind up being, quite successful for the Browns. And, maybe he's not their long-term guy, but I think he's a guy who could potentially, get them to the playoffs if everything's going right. he would be, one of those players who you would expect to, take that sort of, leap up into the, up for the next year. Like obviously see some improvement over what we saw last year in Cleveland. But who are some players, on the current roster, about two, who you think are going to be taking a leap up in, again, whether that's from being a role player to being, a very good starter and, starter to star to superstar. Who do you think?
Honestly, bro, for me, I think Terrace Marshall. You mentioned some of the guys in the receiving core, and sorry to correct you, bro, but Curtis Samuel's actually on the Commanders.
Oh, I always get it confused because I swear because it was him and Terry McLaurin were very good friends, and I think they got split up for a second, and then they came back together. Maybe I think that's what it was.
Right. It's all good. I mean, Curtis Samuel hasn't been able to stay healthy, so I mean, I can't even fault you for that. But I think with Terrace Marshall, he was a rookie last year coming out of LSU. Big target, 6'3". Had a very disappointing, to say the least, rookie year. I mean, 17 catches for 138 yards. I think he was drafted in the middle rounds, 3rd, 4th, or 5th, somewhere in that range. And I just think when you take a guy, in that range, I know it's more that developmental range. And so I'm not expecting huge numbers or anything, but I'm definitely expecting more than 17 catches for 138 yards, especially when you have capable number ones and number two receivers in a DJ Moore and a Robbie Anderson. So you have defenses focusing on other guys, and yet you only capitalize to the tune of 17 catches for 138 yards. Again, I'm not trying to.
And Steezy, not to cut you off, but Terrace Marshall, I thought he was taken in those middle rounds too. He was actually taken in the 2nd round last year. 2nd round pick 59 overall.
I'm tripping then. My bad. I was thinking it was in the middle round. See?
No, but then even more to your point, I think he should be a player who's going to have to step up, especially with what we saw from him at LSU, because I know he was a guy that I had circled, on my metaphorical board for the Packers there, in those sort of like middle rounds if he was able to fall that far.
Right. And so it was definitely underwhelming. And I think he's definitely a guy that could definitely take a leap. Especially if there's better quarterback play, if there's improved quarterback play, if there's healthier quarterback play, if there's better offensive line play, and if there's a head coach that's, wanting to take maybe extra risks just because his job is on the line. I think Terrace Marshall, 2nd-year players either take that sophomore leap or there's that sophomore slump. What's kind of hard to have a worse year than the year that he had last year. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that attributed to his performance, and so I'm not holding it entirely against him, but I think he's definitely in line to kind of step up and take that leap going into year 2, especially, and I don't know if this actually comes to fruition, but especially if Robbie Anderson ends up retiring. Now you have a vacancy at the number 2 wide receiver spot, and I think he could fill in capably, especially with the DJ Moore continuing to emerge as a number 1 wideout in this league. I think Terrace Marshall is definitely set up to succeed.
Yeah, no, again, especially if they get a quarterback in there, obviously, because I think if they stay with, with Matt Corral or with Sam Darnold, I think that we're going to see some frustration coming from that wide receiver room, obviously. I think outside of probably Robbie Anderson. But, looking at that team, I think you can look and, I look through this roster and, there's some people on that you just forget that they have some absolute studs. Obviously, these are some older veteran players, but I completely and totally forgot that they had Corey Littleton. Because I remember a couple of years ago, Corey Littleton was one of the like premier free agents before he got signed by the Raiders. No, but you look, this sounds like a little bit of actually, no, here's a fantastic one. Here's a fantastic one for you. CJ Henderson. You remember him? He was a 1st round pick by I believe it was the Jacksonville Jaguars. He got traded over to the Carolina Panthers. I'm trying to remember what the trade included. I think was it just straight up for a pick?
I think it was just a mid-round pick. Yeah.
For a mid-round pick. CJ Henderson, I'm expecting or I'm hoping that he's able to take that next leap this year. He was able to put up an okay amount of like almost 40 total tackles, but he still only has 1 career interception. It only appears that he played I'm just taking a look. I'm taking a look. He was acquired, midway through the year. Last year, I guess right at the beginning of the year. But I think CJ Henderson is definitely one of those people that you can look to take a step up this year. 2nd year, I guess, in a system, or this is going to be his first, actual off season with the Carolina Panthers. And again, you pair him alongside a guy like a J.C. Horn. And even, through the rest of through last year, he had the ability to learn from a Stephon Gilmore. So I'm expecting him to take a little bit of a step up this year.
Yeah, no doubt. But I think that's definitely a great pick. I mean, people forget just a couple years ago, he was selected ninth overall in the NFL draft in the top 10. And for him to be on his third team in just as many years, that's not a very good sign. But then again, I mean, like you talked about, like you alluded to, bro, he is surrounded by talent, not just in the J.C. Horn, but there's also a Brian Burns. There's also a Derek Brown in the interior of the line. There's a Corey Littleton. There's a Shaq Thompson. There's a Jeremy Chin. And so there's plenty of pieces to work with. It's kind of hard not to look good, especially if you're talented, especially if you're athletic, especially if some of the traits are there. Maybe he needs to be coached up. Maybe he needs to spend some more time, with the rest of the guys in that system. But he's a guy I almost forgot about. So definitely a great pick there. I mean,
yeah, and I think especially I think that there's a lot of times that this happens where there are players who are just so, I don't want to say forgettable, but they're picked in the first round and then all of a sudden, they get traded while they're on their rookie contract and you just forget about that pick happened or, something like that. I think, moving on, who are some players? And again, I think that both of these guys definitely could have, also fit on this, this particular hot seat, players who would potentially be on the hot seat. Do you have anybody else who you think could potentially, if they don't perform this year, they're going to be, looking for a new team?
Well, Sam Darnold's the easy one, so I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to go with his former teammate in New York. And because he hasn't officially retired yet, I think he is an option, and he's an option that I'm going to go with. Wide receiver Robbie Anderson. Real quick, well, let me go back and check.
Yeah, no, I definitely believe that Robbie Anderson is a fantastic choice for this. I think you've seen that he hasn't been, for as much as he's been billed for or built up to be, he has not been, super duper productive or had, a breakout season like I think a lot of people expected him to. You look at his over his career, and it's he only had 1,000-yard season. That was last year. He took a massive step back this year in terms of he only had just above. He played all 17 games and he had just above 500 yards. I mean, that's incredibly frustrating if you're looking at it from a Carolina Panthers perspective.
Right. And thanks for kind of filling in there, bro. Yeah, I keep saying this word, but I mean, I guess it kind of resonates with this Carolina Panthers team, but it's very underwhelming, right? Yeah. I mean, I had him in a couple of fantasy leagues, and I just remember I was like, yo, his first year in Carolina, I know he kind of balled out, like 95 catches, over 1,000 yards. And then this time last year, 50 catches for 519 yards or 53 catches. Like, come on. So that's just not, I don't think that's going to get it done. And especially when we see all these receivers coming into the league via the draft, a whole bunch of young guys starting to shine, Carolina's not going to be very patient with them. And so if he underperforms, if he's not, performing well this year, if he's not producing statistically, if he's not helping them win football games, I think he's on a hot seat. And I think he's as good as gone, just like his former teammate in Sam Darnold.
Yeah, no, again, that is a fantastic choice. And especially if you really look at, some of the stats on this, he had his career low in terms of receiving yards. He had his career low, when it comes to his average, how his average per catch. He had an extra game this year, and he only got, again, this sounds like a lot, but he had last year in 2020, he had 136 targets, he had 95 catches, and he had just over 1,000 yards. This year he had 26 less targets, which is a significant amount. But he only had 26 less targets, but he had 42 less catches. And is part of that on the quarterback room, and because again, I think they had 3 different starting quarterbacks last year. In a Sam Darnold, in a Cam Newton. I think even PJ Walker from the XFL got in there and started a game for him. I think it was that Carolina or the game against the Arizona Cardinals. But you look, and he has been extremely underwhelming. And I know he was a big time trade target and free agency target in 2020 for me for the Packers. I wanted them to go out and sign him big time. But he has for sure been a bit of a disappointment for the Carolina Panthers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but part of it isn't his fault. I definitely feel like he was utilized differently. I mean, he's known more as a deep sort of guy. He's a speedster. He's going to stretch the field for you. You're going to look for him in the deep, passing game. Yeah. And so I think they kind of use them more in the short side of things, short to intermediate, passing game. And I don't think that's necessarily his biggest strength. So you kind of took him away from his strength. And so I think Carolina definitely didn't do him any favors. But at the end of the day, I mean, like I talked about, This is a results-oriented business, fair or not.
Yeah, and I mean when you talk about results, one of the biggest things in terms of results, you got 17 turns at getting a W. That's one of the results. I have the Panthers extremely low. This season on our power rankings, I think that they do get a little. They have a pretty rough schedule. They do. They're lucky that they play in the division they play in, so they get to play Atlanta twice. They get to play Detroit this year, but they play the AFC North and they play they play the AFC North and they play the NFC West. They're in for a rough season. They really are.
Yeah, I mean, and that might be, you might be a little generous, in that statement. Yeah. But I think again, and I kind of already put out a record, not an official record prediction, but I did say if they eventually trade for a Baker, I could see them, shooting for 7 with a ceiling of 8 wins. You know what I mean? And I think because they are, I'm going to say they finish 7-10, 8-9, 6-11, anywhere in that range. Sorry if I don't have an official record. I just think it falls somewhere, between those three. But I think with Christian McCaffrey hopefully being able to stay healthy, with the defense that's continuing to improve, with the Matt Rule feeling the pressure, with him sitting on the hot seat, I definitely feel like, they're going to eclipse the 5 wins that they've been able to win the last couple of years. And I think that's going to be enough, just barely enough, to keep Matt Rule around in Carolina for at least one more season.
Yeah, I think, again, as you've kind of said throughout this entire thing, as long as you're seeing improvement, they probably won't fire him. So if they are able to get up into that, 6 to 8 win, category, I think that there is a chance that he winds up keeping his job, especially because I don't think Carolina, especially with what we saw, towards the end of Ron Rivera's career, I don't think that they're super duper, willing to move off of a coach. I think this is only, I'm trying to just think of all the coaches they've had, in my lifetime. And I really think, obviously there was a time pre-Ron Rivera, but the two people I've known, it's been Ron Rivera and it's now been Matt Rule for, I believe he's going into his 3rd season. So, I don't think we necessarily, talked about this one, but what are some expectations that you have, for the Panthers this year? Obviously you want them to get better, but what do you think, overall, what are some expectations that you have from the team that you want to see?
Man, that's a great question. I think for me, on top of, in addition to improving red zone defense, I mean, because they have such a talented defense, it's like, why do they struggle so immensely in the red zone? Is that on the coaching staff? Is that on the play calls? Is that on the players, the personnel, or is it a combination of all three? And so I definitely want to see that red zone defense improve, because they shouldn't be that bad. Now with all that talent, now with all those pieces, now with all these guys that are emerging. And so, and I know this doesn't exactly, I guess, answer the question, but I do want to see Yetur Gross-Matos. He's a guy that we have yet to talk about today. But if Carolina was so content with letting Hassan Reddick go, could that potentially mean that they're invested in his future and that they're willing to kind of, gamble? And I know he hasn't had the best start to his career. What was it last year? 4 sacks. His rookie year, 3 sacks. And so he hasn't been able to, produce statistically. But I think with them letting a Hassan Reddick go, I think that shows faith in a Yetur Gross-Matos. And so I want to see him. I know he's an individual player, but I want to see him kind of take that next step forward, because now there's another vacancy. At that edge spot. And Brian Burns can only do so much. Derek Brown can only do so much. And so Yetur Gross-Matos, I'm looking for him to kind of, I guess, reward the Carolina Panthers for having faith in them.
Yeah, and I think especially when you look at the entire, the team offensively, they were they were 3rd to bottom in the league in yards gained. They brought in a new offensive coordinator, I believe, this year, in Ben McAdoo, who doesn't exactly have a fantastic track record, but I think he has enough NFL experience that we should be expecting some sort of improvement from him. Again, last year the Carolina Panthers in defense, they were 2nd in yards. Obviously the Buffalo Bills were, blew everybody out of the water, but the Panthers weren't exactly slouches either. They were very good. Again, I think it's a fantastic point in terms of them having to improve on the red zone, but I want to see something from the offense. I really do. I think you look, and they were bottom in pretty much every category when you really, take a look at it. They were, fourth from last in total passing yards. And so that obviously means in passing yards per game as well. And they were a little bit higher and closer to the middle of the pack in terms of rushing yards, but they were pretty pathetic offensively scoring points. They were scoring just about 18 points a game. And that's not going to win you a whole lot of games in the NFL unless your defense is just absolutely legit.
And I think their defense, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, but their defense had plenty of flashes. They were 5-0 last year in games in which they allowed less than 15 points. It is a cherry-picked stat. You could say whatever you want to about it, but it is still 5-0 when they allow under 15. So I think, to me, that tells me that defense showed a lot of potential and should be a lot better in the red zone as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. Steezy, this episode flew by, absolutely flew by. We had a good episode of the Bolt yesterday. I didn't get to see all your guys, or not all your guys' NBA talk, but just in terms of the mock drafts. I know, are you a big NBA draft guy?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What do you think? Just picking your brain at the end of this, the Panthers talk will stop here. So if you're a Panthers fan, you can feel free to talk out. What do you think? A local guy like Apollo Banchero goes. Where do you obviously you and me both from the Seattle area. I know I'm not sure where you went to high school. I went to Mount Rainier, so I know, I believe he went to O'Day. But yeah, what do you think about a local guy like Apollo?
I went to Cambridge High School.
Oh, there we go. Hey, same school district. There we go.
I think Apollo. So I have him slotted at number 3 in my NBA mock draft. And I think with Paolo, I'd like to see him go number 1 overall. I just think with the Orlando Magic picking at first overall, they want a guy that can kind of help stretch the floor. And with the Paolo, he's shown improved shot making, especially from 3. And I think offensively, it's almost like he doesn't have a weakness. You know what I mean? And so I'm just not sure if his ceiling eclipses that of a Jabari Smith. Maybe it is, I guess in the same vicinity, but I just think with the Jabari Smith, he's a stretch 4. He's a guy that was the number 1 option for a team in Auburn that surprised many by making that run all the way to the NCAA tourney. And I think it was Dylan who made this comparison, but he sees a lot of Rashard Lewis. And I saw another pro player comparison in Chris Bosh to a Jabari Smith. And so he's also elite defensively, and Paolo Banchero, for as good as he is offensively, defensively, he doesn't have anywhere near the same sort of impact. And I think with Orlando, they're looking for guys that not only can stretch the floor, but also, be elite defensively and block shots and whatnot. And so I think, that being said, he's not going number 1. Number 2, Oklahoma City, they need a big. I think they need a pure 5. Their starting backcourt is set, and I think offensively they have pieces that they could work with. I think Paolo, I could see him working in OKC, and I don't know if this is going to affect the decision-making process, but he definitely has a hatred for the Oklahoma City Thunder. And seeing as how, he is a Seattleite, this.
Oh, yeah.
We can't root for the Thunder. We can't the Thunder. And so I think that being said, Chet Holmgren is probably going to go 2nd overall, and then Paolo at number 3 to the Houston Rockets. I told the fellas this on the show yesterday, but I might start rooting for the Houston Rockets. You know what I mean? Especially if they get Paolo, because now you have a Seattle guy in Paolo. You have another Seattle guy in Kevin Porter Jr. And then in a Jalen Green, who's half Filipino. Come on, yo, we don't see no Filipinos in the league. So it's like, outside of the Heat, you might see me repping a couple of Rockets jerseys here and there.
Hey, you need to have an Eastern and Western Conference team. I think, especially like once your team is out of the running, you need to have a second team for sure. Obviously, the Rockets haven't been in the running for the past couple of years since getting rid of James Harden, but I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying for sure. Yeah, but it's been an absolute blast having you on, Steezy. Thank you once again for filling in. Feel free to plug your stuff.
Yes, sir. Emmitt, hey, as always, bro, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I love doing this with you. Love having these conversations with you. But to everybody listening, to everybody that's tuned in, to everybody that will tune in, if you aren't already subscribed, man, what are you doing? Be sure to hit that subscribe button. Be sure to show some support, show some love, drop a comment. Save this to your watch later playlist if you can't watch the entire thing. If you weren't able to watch it live, obviously you can watch it, once it's not live anymore, whenever you want, whenever you have time. If you're driving and you have a long ways to go, you got about 40 minutes to spare, why not give us a listen, y'all? Come on. So at the C Team Podcast, be sure to subscribe, follow on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, same handles. And then last but not least, you can find me at Steezy A. Smith, as you can see right here. And don't forget to subscribe to Ask Wobble Says as well, so you can tune into the Bolt, the weekly sports debate show that we hop on every Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. And I'd be remiss not to bring up our good friend at Mr. Dylan Brewski 13 and our Monday Night Fight Talk on all social media platforms. If you're a UFC or MMA guy, that's it for me.
Yeah, of course, for me, it's always at Emmitt Sevores on Instagram and Twitter. I'll throw them all right down here. Make sure to follow my guy Dallas. He hasn't been able to be on. I believe we should have a Mariners episode coming out in just about. I think we're going to be recording that one somewhat soon. I think we're going to let the series with the A's finish out. We've been lacking a little bit, but Dallas has been so crushed with work that we haven't been able to record. But once again, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next time.